Hey everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. We're back, and you probably know how this works by now, but just as a refresher, you give us the material, and we'll dive right in and extract those golden nuggets for you. This time we're exploring spatial perception, surfing, and consciousness, all guided by listener Dan Weber's book, Surfism, The Fluid Foundation of Consciousness, and some of his research as well. I'm excited about this one.
Yeah, me too. I have to admit, when I first heard about Dan's work, I thought, surfing as a metaphor to explain the mind. Sounds a little stick there out there, right? But let me tell you, once you really get into it, the connections he makes are pretty fascinating.
I was a little skeptical too at first, but I gotta say, I'm starting to come around. Okay, so let's break this down. Yeah. Dan's whole idea seems to revolve around this concept called optic flow. So what exactly is optic flow?
Well, imagine you're driving down a road and the way the scenery rushes past you, creating a sense of motion and speed.
Okay, yeah.
That's optic flow. Weber argues that this feeling of movement, this change in our visual field over time, is actually the foundation for how we build our sense of the physical world.
Wow.
It's through movement that we understand space, not the other way around.
So instead of thinking of space as this static container that we exist in, it's more like something that emerges from our movement through it.
Exactly. And this idea that motion is ontologically prior to space, as Weber puts it. Yeah. This has huge implications for how we understand consciousness. He's essentially saying that our awareness isn't rooted in a fixed point, a static self, but rather in the dynamic flow of experience.
It's like those moments when you're so absorbed in the flow of riding a wave that you kind of lose track of yourself as this separate entity.
Right.
You become part of the weight, part of that movement.
That's a perfect example. And Weber argues that this feeling of interconnectedness, the sense of merging with something larger than ourselves, is actually a more accurate reflection of our true nature than our usual spatially defined sense of self.
So are you saying that our focus on boundaries and separation actually limits our experience of reality?
It's not that spatial perception is wrong or bad.
Okay.
It's just that it's only part of the picture. Weber argues that by overemphasizing the spatial, the seeing self, we lose touch with the temporal, the feeling self, and that's where we find true presence and connection.
That reminds me of how we use all these visual metaphors to describe consciousness, like the light bulb moment or the mirror of the mind.
Right.
But maybe a wave is a more apt metaphor, constantly in motion, always changing, reflecting that dynamic flow of our awareness.
I think that's a brilliant insight, and it highlights how these metaphors can help us grasp these incredibly complex concepts that are otherwise difficult to put into words.
That's pretty profound. So he's saying the way we perceive space through optic flow directly impacts how present we feel in the moment.
That's the core idea. And to back this up, he brings in some heavy hitters from the world of philosophy, guys like Thomas Fuchs, Samuel Todes, Erwin Strauss, all phenomenological philosophers.
I'll be honest, philosophy isn't exactly my forte. Give me the crash course. What is phenomenology all about?
Sure. Think of it this way. Phenomenology is all about understanding the world through our own personal experiences. Instead of trying to be like completely objective, it focuses on how we experience things subjectively, like what it feels like to be alive in the world.
Okay, that makes sense. And I guess that ties into Dan's idea of losing presence when we overthink things, right? We're not in the moment anymore.
You got it. But here's the thing. These philosophers are talking about this idea of how our immediate subjective experience kind of gets put on hold when we try to analyze it too much. But they're not specifically talking about optic flow. That connection is Dan's unique contribution.
So these philosophers noticed this phenomenon, but didn't connect it to optic flow.
Right.
You sent me some quotes that are really interesting. Let's see if we can break them down for our listeners.
Okay.
So Thomas Fuchs, he says, this original perspectivist subjective spatiality is suspended by the geographical space of imperspectival objectifying knowledge.
That's a mouthful.
Yeah. Can you put that in normal words for me?
Sure. So he's basically saying that our initial personal experience of space, which is tied to our own perspective and movement, gets overridden by a more objective understanding of space.
Okay.
So think about walking through a forest.
Okay.
And you're feeling the leaves brush against you. You can smell the damp earth.
Right.
That's the perspectivist subjective experience.
Okay.
But then you pull out a map to figure out where you are.
Oh.
And suddenly you're looking at the forest from this detached objective viewpoint.
So I'm trading in my immediate sensory experience for a more abstract understanding of the forest.
Exactly. And that shift, according to Fuchs, diminishes our sense of presence in the moment.
Okay.
And then we've got Samuel Todes.
Okay.
He says, in all empirical determination, therefore we somehow make ourselves passive objects of our own spontaneity.
I feel like I need to read that a couple times.
It's a dense one.
Okay, so what Toes is trying to say is that by analyzing our surroundings, we actually make ourselves less like active participants.
Yes.
And more like passive observers.
Exactly.
So instead of just being in the world and moving through it and experiencing it directly, we take a step back. Okay, I'm starting to see the pattern here.
Yeah.
We're going from feeling to analyzing, from immersion to detachment.
Right.
And it seems like that's the trade-off for gaining a stable understanding of space.
Mm-hmm.
But where does Heidegger fit into all this?
Yeah.
He's talking about like metaphysics and the truth of being.
Right.
How does that relate to optic flow and presence?
Well, it might seem a little out of place, but bear with me.
Okay.
So Heidegger asks, why does metaphysics not recall the truth of being? And what he's suggesting is that by focusing so much on objects and analyzing those objects, we might be overlooking a more fundamental experience of just being in the world.
So by getting caught up in analyzing everything around us,
right,
labeling it, figuring out how it all works, we kind of miss out on the simple experience of just existing.
Yes, of being present in that moment.
It's like we're so busy looking at the trees, we forget to experience the forest.
Exactly.
Okay. And then Erwin Strauss,
he
suggests that to gain objective knowledge, I have to break through this perceptival bind.
Right.
So essentially, we have to detach from our immediate experience.
Yes, our embodied experience.
To see the world objectively.
From a more distant analytical standpoint?
So it's like I'm putting on these scientific glasses that let me see the world clearly.
Yes.
But they also filter out some of the richness of the experience itself.
Exactly.
So Strauss is saying kind of the same thing as the other guys.
Yeah.
That there's this cost to gaining objective knowledge. We trade in some of that immediacy.
Right.
That sense of being fully present.
Yes. Yes.
And immersed in the world.
Exactly.
So all these phenomenologists, despite their different approaches, seem to be saying the same thing.
Yes.
That there's this fundamental shift in our perception.
Yes.
That happens when we move from like a subjective embodied experience to a more detached analytical mode.
Right. And what's so fascinating about Dan Weber's work is that he connects this directly to the mechanics of optic flow.
Oh, okay. I think we need to pause here for a second and let our listeners catch their breath.
Yeah.
We covered a lot of ground in this first part.
We did.
When we come back, we'll delve deeper into Weber's insights and explore why he thinks phenomenologists might have missed this crucial connection to optic flow.
Great. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
Welcome back, everyone. Before the break, we were talking about how our brains sort of walk this tightrope between using optic flow for immediacy and for spatial awareness.
Right, and it sounds like Dan Weber thinks there's a key piece missing from how the phenomenologists see this whole thing.
Yeah, he argues that even though phenomenologists have talked about this shift from subjective feeling to objective analysis, they haven't really connected it to how our brains actually process optic flow.
I see what you mean. So if phenomenology is all about understanding our lived experience, why wouldn't they consider something as fundamental as how our brains use movement to make sense of space?
That's a great question, and Weber suggests that maybe it's because optic flow is just so automatic.
Okay.
It happens so far below our conscious radar that we just tend to overlook its role in shaping our experience.
Yeah, like breathing.
Exactly.
We don't really think about it.
Right.
But it's like totally essential to life.
Yes.
So maybe optic flow is like that for our sense of space and presence.
And Weber takes this even further, right?
Yeah.
He connects different psychological states to what he calls distortions of this space-time continuum.
He does, and he uses some really vivid visual analogies to illustrate these distortions.
Okay.
For example,
yeah,
imagine a picture where a tiny man appears to be standing on someone's outstretched hand as if they were incredibly small.
Yeah. It's obviously an illusion.
Yeah.
But it still looks so real.
Well, Weber argues that this kind of spatial distortion, where our perception of size and distance gets warped, is similar to what happens in neurosis.
So when someone's really anxious or fixated on something, it's like their mind is creating this warped perspective, making them see things out of proportion.
Exactly. They're stuck in a rigid, distorted perception of reality.
Right.
Now, imagine a different kind of distortion.
Okay.
Think of a portrait where the facial features are all jumbled.
Okay.
The nose is on the forehead. The mouth is where the ears should be.
Right.
but you can still recognize it as a face.
Okay, that sounds more unsettling than the tiny man.
This is how Weber represents psychosis.
Okay.
The flow of time and experience becomes disrupted,
Okay.
making it hard to make sense of what's happening.
So, in neurosis, you're fixated on a warped spatial perspective.
Right.
But in psychosis, the whole flow of time and experience gets scrambled.
You got it.
Okay.
And Weber suggests that surfing,
Okay.
with its inherent balance between spatial and temporal elements,
Right.
represents a healthy balance on this continuum. Starting to see how this all comes together.
It's a pretty powerful way to look at it, right? And to make it even more tangible, Dan goes deeper into the specifics of surfing. He uses different elements of surfing to represent different psychological states. For example, he compares tide levels to the neurotransmitter serotonin.
Oh, we're going from surfing to brain chemistry now. This is getting pretty deep.
It is. And it's fascinating stuff. Imagine a high tide right. Big, smooth waves. Dan connects this to high serotonin levels, which are associated with feeling calm and connected.
Okay, I'm picturing myself gliding effortlessly on that wave, feeling totally zen.
Exactly. That's the feeling he's trying to capture. He suggests that high serotonin creates a sense of expansiveness, similar to riding a big, smooth wave. You're not getting tossed around by choppy little waves. You're cruising.
This is cool. So what happens when the tide is low? Does that mean low serotonin?
You got it. Dan equates low tide to low serotonin levels, and those are often associated with anxiety, negativity, difficulty managing emotions, because the incline of the seabed is much more sudden. And Dan doesn't stop there. He also connects the shape of the surfboard to another key neurotransmitter, dopamine.
Okay, now I'm really curious. I'm guessing it's not just about how the board looks right.
No way. It's about how it performs. Dan links the responsiveness of a surfboard to dopamine levels. So picture yourself riding a really responsive board. It's quick, it's agile, you have total control. You're carving turns, maneuvering through the water with ease.
Yeah, I can almost feel that rush, just imagining it, like you become one with the wave.
Right. And that feeling, Dan links it to high dopamine levels, motivation engagement, that rush of reward. Dopamine's all about pleasure and reward. So it makes sense that a responsive board, which lets you have a more exciting and successful ride, would be a good analogy.
Okay, that makes sense. So what's the low dopamine version of this? Is it like riding a rusty old board that barely moves?
You nailed it. Imagine riding a clunky, unresponsive board. It's hard to maneuver. It's frustrating. You're putting in all this effort, but not really getting anywhere.
Yeah, that wouldn't be much fun. I could see how that ties into the feeling of low dopamine. Lethargic, unmotivated, struggling to find enjoyment.
Exactly. It's like you're stuck in a rut, unable to catch that wave of motivation. And Dan doesn't just use these surfing elements to represent neurotransmitters. He also uses the boundaries of the surf zone itself to depict the boundaries of the self.
The boundaries of the self. I'm not sure I follow.
Think about where the waves break close to shore, right? The shallows. Dan sees this as a representation of a neurotic state of mind.
Neurotic, so like overly anxious and worried.
Exactly. In this state, a person feels totally overwhelmed by their thoughts and emotions. Like they can't separate themselves from that constant mental chatter. It's like being pummeled by wave after wave in those shallows.
I can definitely relate to that feeling, like you're stuck in a loop of negative thoughts.
Now imagine the opposite. The deep water beyond the surf break. Dan connects this to a psychotic state of mind.
Wow. Okay, so not just anxious, but like a disconnect from reality.
That's how he's using it. It represents a detachment from the values and norms of society, a sense of isolation, and a loss of touch with shared reality.
This is getting pretty deep. It's fascinating how he can use these simple surfing elements to represent such complex psychological concepts.
I know, right? He's created this whole framework for understanding ourselves through the lens of surfing. But there's one last element we need to unpack before we can really dive into what this all means. Dan makes a distinction between what the surfer sees while riding a wave and the feeling of the surfboard under their feet.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How do those two things tie into everything else?
He suggests that what the surfer sees represents the ego's concern with image and appearance. It's about how we present ourselves to the world, how we want to be seen, putting on a good show.
So it's that outward focus on image rather than internal experience.
Exactly. Now contrast that with the feeling of the surfboard under the surfer's feet. Dan links that to the intuitive sense of being present in the moment.
Ah, so it's about being grounded, feeling the wave through your whole body,
Right.
not just seeing it.
Precisely. It's about being immersed in the experience beyond all the mental chatter of the ego. Dan suggests that by tuning into those sensations, that feeling of the board beneath us, we can tap into a much deeper level of awareness.
This is really making me think differently about how I experience things. It's like Dan has given us this whole new language for understanding our minds.
He has. And as we've seen, it's not just some arbitrary metaphor. He's grounding his ideas in both scientific understanding of things like neurotransmitters and philosophical concepts, but there's still one big question hanging in the air, right?
You mean like, are we all supposed to become surfers now?
Pretty much, yeah. That's a great question, and it's one we'll tackle head on in the next part of our deep dive into Dan's work. Don't touch that dial, folks.
Welcome back, everyone. So last time we left off with this big question.
Sure.
Is Dan saying that we all need to become surfers to like unlock the secrets of our minds?
Right. I know it sounds that way, doesn't it? But it's a bit more nuanced than that. Dan clarifies that surfing itself isn't actually the path to enlightenment or anything. He's really using it as a powerful metaphor to explain these complex psychological ideas in a way that we can all wrap our heads around.
So it's more about the analogy itself, not necessarily having to actually ride the waves.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Surfing provides all this. Rich imagery and experience, right? The waves, the board, the feeling of the ocean. And Dan uses that to create this model of the psyche, this map of our inner world.
Okay, that makes more sense. I mean, not everyone has access to the ocean,
No.
let alone the skills to surf. So it's good to know that's not a prerequisite for understanding this stuff.
Right, exactly. But we can all imagine what it would be like to ride a wave, to feel the power of the ocean. And that's what makes this metaphor so universally relatable.
I'm starting to see how this all fits together. So what's the big takeaway here? What does Dan want us to gain from this whole surfism model?
He believes that by understanding the interplay of all these different surfing elements, the tide, the board, the boundaries of the surf zone, we can gain a much deeper understanding of ourselves and our own psychological states.
So it's like a tool for self-awareness, a way to better understand what's going on inside our own heads.
Exactly. It gives us this new language to talk about our internal experiences, to recognize the patterns and forces that shape our thoughts and feelings. It's like he's created a decoder ring for our inner world.
I love that analogy. So instead of saying, I'm feeling anxious today, you could say, man, I'm stuck in the shallows today.
Perfect example. It adds a layer of richness and nuance to how we understand ourselves. And it also reminds us that, just like surfing life is a dynamic process, we're always navigating changing conditions, adjusting to the ebb and flow of experience.
And sometimes wiping out spectacularly.
Absolutely. But even those wipeouts are part of the journey. They teach us about resilience, balance, and getting back up and trying again.
Okay. I'm really starting to appreciate the depth of this metaphor. It's more than just a clever analogy. It's a whole framework for understanding the human experience.
It really is. And remember that question we had earlier about optic flow and presence? Dan was surprised that this connection wasn't more widely discussed. Why do you think that is?
It is kind of strange, isn't it? It seems like such a fundamental part of how we experience the world. Why wouldn't it be more widely recognized?
Well, Dan offers a couple of possibilities. First, he wonders if it's because this mechanism is so fundamental, so essential to our experience that it actually becomes invisible to us. Like we don't notice it because it's always there, like the air we breathe.
So it's so essential that it fades into the background of our awareness.
Exactly. It's like the foundation of our perceptual experience,
Right.
the bedrock upon which everything else is built. And because it's so fundamental, we don't even think to question it or examine it closely.
That's a really interesting way to look at it. It's like trying to describe what it feels like to have a body. It's so constant that it's almost impossible to even conceptualize.
Right. It's just there. And building on that idea, Dan also proposes that the very invisibility of this mechanism might be what makes it so difficult to study and really wrap our minds around. Like we haven't developed the right tools or language to grasp it fully yet.
So it's like trying to explain a color that no one has ever seen before.
Exactly. It's hard to even ask the right questions when we're dealing with something so fundamental to our experience.
This is getting pretty meta. It makes you wonder what other hidden mechanisms might be shaping our experience without us even realizing it.
Absolutely. And that's what makes Dan's work so thought-provoking. He's shining a light on something that's always been there, but has remained largely unexplored.
He's definitely given us a lot to think about. As much as I'd love to keep geeking out about this all day, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
I agree. But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to Dan's surfing metaphor and those specific elements he uses to represent different psychological states. We touched on them earlier, but I think it's worth diving in a little deeper.
Yeah, let's do it. We talked about tide levels representing serotonin and surfboard responsiveness representing dopamine. But I'm really curious to hear more about those boundaries of the surf zone, how he uses those.
Right. So remember how we talked about the shallows representing that neurotic state of mind?
Yeah, that feeling of being overwhelmed by thoughts and emotions, like being pummeled by those waves close to shore.
Exactly. Dan describes this state as being unable to separate yourself from that constant mental chatter. You're fixated on the immediate threats, and you can't really see the bigger picture.
It's like being trapped in that cycle of anxiety, just
Aw.
getting pounded by wave after wave. What about the deep water beyond the break? That was the psychotic state of mind, right?
And it's important to clarify that Dan's not trying to diagnose anyone with these terms. He's using them metaphorically to represent different ways of being in the world. So in this case, the deep water symbolizes a detachment from shared reality, a loss of connection with those values and norms that most people share.
So it's like being lost at sea, adrift in a world of your own.
That's a good way to put it. It represents a sense of isolation and a disconnect from those shared anchors of reality that most of us rely on.
This is pretty heavy stuff. It makes you wonder if there's like a sweet spot in this metaphor. A place where you're not overwhelmed by the shallows, but you're not lost in the depths either.
That's a great point. And Dan actually addresses that in his book. He suggests that this ideal state lies in finding a balance between those two extremes. It's about being able to navigate both the shallows and the deep water, to be comfortable in both the chaos and the calm.
That makes a lot of sense. It's like finding that perfect wave, right? The one that's challenging enough to be exciting, but not so overwhelming.
Yeah.
That you wipe out.
Exactly. It's about finding that flow state where you're in harmony with the forces around you, able to respond and adapt without losing yourself in the process.
I'm starting to see how this surfing metaphor can be a really practical tool for understanding and navigating the challenges of life. It's about finding that balance, that sweet spot where we can ride the waves without being swept away.
Exactly. And remember that last distinction Dan made between the surfers' visual perspective and the feeling of the board under their feet.
Yeah. The visual perspective being the ego's focus on image, and the feeling of the board being that deeper, more intuitive sense of presence.
Right. Dan points out that both perspectives are important, but he suggests that we often get too caught up in the visual, that ego-driven desire to be seen and perceived a certain way.
So we're so focused on looking good on the wave that we forget to actually feel the wave.
Exactly, and that's where the feeling of the board comes in. It represents that grounded, embodied experience, that sense of being fully present in the moment beyond all that mental chatter of the ego.
It's like those moments when you're so engrossed in an activity that you completely lose track of time and self-consciousness. You're just fully present in the experience.
That's a great example, and Dan argues that by tuning into those sensations, those feelings of the board beneath us, we can tap into a much deeper level of awareness and presence.
This is making me really rethink my whole approach to experience. It's like I'm so focused on the visual, on the external, that I've been missing out on this whole other dimension of perception.
That's a really common experience, and it's something that Dan's work helps us to recognize and address. By understanding this distinction, we can start to shift our focus and cultivate a deeper connection to our own embodied experience.
I'm excited to explore this more. It feels like we've only scratched the surface of what Dan's work has to offer.
I agree. We've definitely laid a solid foundation.
Yeah.
But there's still one more piece of the puzzle we need to address.
And what's that?
Well, Dan's work raises some pretty profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself. Is it something that we create through our perception, or is it something that exists independently of us?
Well, those are some big questions. I don't know if I'm ready to tackle the mysteries of the universe just yet.
Don't worry, we'll take it one wave at a time. Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore these deeper implications of Dan's work.
All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Dan Weber's Surfism. Last time we were left with a pretty massive wave to ride, the nature of consciousness itself.
Yeah, that's a big one, isn't it? But luckily, Dan's work gives us a pretty unique surfboard to navigate those waters.
I like that analogy. So how does this surfing metaphor help us understand something as complex as consciousness?
Well, remember how Dan emphasizes the importance of both the visual perspective representing the ego and the feeling of the board underfoot representing that deeper sense of presence?
Yeah, it's like we need both the head and the body to fully experience the world.
Right, and Dan suggests that consciousness itself might actually emerge from that interplay, from that interaction between our internal experience and the external world.
So it's not just something that's happening inside our heads, but it's a process that arises from our engagement with the world around us.
That's one way to interpret his work. He seems to be pushing back against the idea that consciousness is solely a product of the brain, suggesting that it's something more dynamic, more relational.
That's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
But it kind of makes sense when you think about it. Our experiences are constantly shaping and being shaped by our interactions with the world.
Exactly. And Dan's surfing metaphor helps us to visualize this process. Imagine the surfer constantly adjusting to the changing waves, shifting their weight, finding their balance.
It's like a dance between the surfer and the ocean.
Perfect analogy. And Dan suggests that consciousness might be like that dance, a constant interplay between our inner world and those external forces we encounter.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It makes consciousness seem less like this fixed state and more like a fluid, ever-evolving process.
And just like surfing it requires skill awareness and a willingness to adapt to those changing conditions.
This whole conversation has been really mind-expanding. I feel like I have a whole new appreciation for the complexity of my own experience.
I'm glad to hear that. But before we wrap things up, I want to circle back to Dan's observation that the connection between optic flow and presence isn't more widely discussed. We talked about some possible explanations earlier, but I think there's one more worth considering.
Okay, I'm listening.
I think it's possible that this connection has been overlooked because it challenges some deeply ingrained assumptions we have about the world.
Like what kind of assumptions?
Well, we tend to think of ourselves as separate from the world, right? As observers looking out at this fixed and objective reality.
But Dan's work suggests that we're more intertwined with the world than we realize.
Right, and the idea that our very sense of presence of being in the world is directly influenced by something as basic as optic flow that really challenges that separation.
It's like we're not just observing the world, we're actively participating in its creation through our perception.
Exactly, and that's a pretty profound shift in perspective. It makes you wonder what other aspects of our reality might be shaped by our perception in ways we haven't even considered.
This is blowing my mind. It's like Dan has given us a whole new set of lenses to see the world through.
He has. And that's what makes his work so valuable. He's not just offering answers. He's raising important questions that can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves and the universe we inhabit.
Well, I know I'm going to be thinking about all of this for a long time to come. Any final words of wisdom for our listeners before we hang 10 and ride off into the sunset?
Just one. I'd encourage everyone to check out Dan's book, Surfism, The Fluid Foundation of Consciousness, and explore these ideas further. He goes into a lot more detail than we could cover here, and I guarantee it'll spark your own deep dive into the mysteries of the mind.
That's great advice. And as always, a huge thank you to our amazing listeners for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the world of ideas.